Hello friends, this is Miss Ella and I'm happy to see you for another Harmony at Home lesson. We have done so many different things over the past 3 lessons and I hope you are having as much fun as I am learning about music together. And there is still so much more to discover. Do you remember the Baroque composer Bach from our class last week? Today we are going to take a close look at one of his most famous pieces, and we will be joined by one of our Harmony at Home friends who will teach us more about what the world was like when Bach wrote his music. Before that, we have our weekly game, of course. Last week we played the double echo, and I told you we were going to get better by practicing, like everything else in life. So today we will do some more rhythms. Don't forget, your attention should be on 2 things at once: the rhythm I'm doing and where I am doing it. While you're repeating the first rhythm, stay focused for the next one. Are you ready? Let's start. Was it easier this time? We will continue to work on that. I'm sure you will do better each time. Last week we talked about the Baroque period and about Bach, a very famous composer from that period. Do you remember his full name? Where did he live? The composer's full name was Johann Sebastian Bach, and he was from Germany, a country in Europe. Bach was a composer and a teacher. Today I would like us to listen to one of his famous pieces, a concerto for 2 violins and orchestra. Let's listen to the beginning and then we can discuss the piece and try a fun activity along with this wonderful music. know any of the instruments playing? Did you recognize the harpsichord we learned about last week? Did you notice the two violin players standing in front of the orchestra? Those are the soloists. They play the important part, the solo part. Do you remember we talked about it last week when we listened to the third Brandenburg Concerto? The orchestra is playing the accompaniment, the tutti part. Tutti means all or together. Do you know what language I'm speaking when I say the words solo and tutti? Just like the words piano, forte, diminuendo, and tempo you have already learned, solo and tutti are also Italian, the language of music. This piece we are listening to is a concerto for two violins and orchestra. Concerto is again an Italian word. The two violins will be playing with an orchestra, and they get to play the important part. That's why they are in front. This concerto, like most concertos, has three parts, or as we call it in music, three movements. As I mentioned in our first lesson, movements are sort of like chapters of a book. In music, every movement is different but related to the one before. Every movement has a different tempo. Let's listen again to the beginning of the first movement. Listen carefully to the violins part. The first phrase played by the violins is very important. You will see that Bach uses the same phrase through the whole movement. Let's take a closer look at the rhythm of this phrase. Let's say the rhythm slowly together. The first four notes we will say tika tika. Say it with me, tika tika. For the notes that follow those four we will say ti, and we will have 8 of those. Ti 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 ti. Say it with me, ti 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 ti. So now let's say the 4 first notes with the 8 that follow. Listen once. Tika tika ti 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 ti. Say it with me. Tika tika ti 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 ti. Now let's add the body percussion for this part. It will help you memorize it. The tika tika we will play by tapping our thighs like this. Tika tika. And the ti 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 we will play by clapping. Ti 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 ti. Look once how it looks from the beginning. Tika tika ti 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 ti. Do it with me. Ready? Tika tika ti 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 ti. Let's do it a little bit faster. Ready? And tika tika ti 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 ti. One more time. Tika tika ti 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 ti. Now let's listen to the beginning again and try to recognize the rhythm we just did. Listen carefully to what comes after the rhythm you already know. So, did you hear what happens after the rhythm we just did? There is a long note. It's the longest note in this phrase. We will say ta and we will use another body percussion. Ta. Do it with me. Ta. This long note is followed by 2 short notes that you already know. Tika. And those 2 are followed by ti again. This time we will have 10 of those. Ti, 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 ti. Let me show you from the long note and then we will do it together. Ta, tika, ti, 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 ti. Let's do it together. Ready? Ta, tika, ti, 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 ti. One more time. Ta, tika, ti, 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 ti. Let's do it from the beginning. Do you remember? We start with 4 tika. Tika, tika. Then we have 8 ti, 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 ti. Followed by the long note, ta. Then 2 short notes, tika and ti, 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 ti. 10 at the end. Let's do it slowly. Ready? Tika, tika, ti, 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 ta. Tika, ti, 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 ti. One more time, slowly. Tika, tika, ti, 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 ta. Tika, ti, 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 ti. Let's do it a little bit faster. Ready? And tika, tika, ti, 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 ta. Tika, ti, 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 ti. Again. Tika, tika, ti, 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 ta. Tika, ti, 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 ti. Very good. Now we have to add one last thing to finish this phrase. We will add 3 long notes. They are long, but they are still shorter than the one we did ta, like this. So we will say ta, but we will be clapping in a different way. Ta, ta, ta. Can you do it? Ta, ta, ta. Let's do it from the beginning, adding those 3 notes at the end. Ready? Tika, tika, ti, 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 ta. Tika, ti, 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 ta, ta, ta. Very good. One last time. Ready? Tika, tika, ti, 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 ta. Tika, ti, 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 ta, ta, ta. This was the right tempo. That's the way Bach heard it in his head. And that's the way he wrote it for the violins and the orchestra. Did you notice that the first violin starts the phrase and the other one is waiting? Listen carefully and try to figure out what does the second violin play when the first one finishes his phrase. Did you notice what happens? The second violin plays the same phrase, imitating the first one. Do you remember that last week Jeffrey, the harpsichord player, demonstrated the imitation on his instrument? It also makes me think about the canon we did with our song from Ghana. Do you remember? One voice imitating the other. Let's listen again, and you can do the rhythm we learned twice. Once with the first violin and once with the second one. It should work. Did you hear it? Did you start again with the second violin? Did you hear the third time the same phrase starts? It's hard to hear it. It's one of the lowest instruments in the orchestra, the cello. We will get the opportunity to talk about this instrument next week. Did you hear the fourth time played by the violins? We find this repetition through the whole movement. You can listen to it again at the end of the lesson and try to count how many times Bach uses the same phrase and which instruments are playing it. Let's listen to another recording of the same piece, played by a wonderful violin player you will meet next week. His name is Joshua Bell. In this recording, he plays together with healthcare workers to thank them for their heroic efforts to keep us safe during the global health crisis.
Hello, I'm Joshua Bell. Over the past several months, I've been so moved by the heroism of the healthcare workers who have really risked their lives on the front lines of this pandemic. I'm also very much aware that many of them are fabulous musicians, so I'm glad I have this opportunity to make some music with some of them.
You worked very hard today. I'm so proud of you. Now I will introduce you to our guest. Our guest today is a friend of mine, Ted Wiprud. Ted is a musician, a composer, and an educator. And he's going to spend a few minutes with us to help us understand the world Bach lived in and why his music and baroque music sounds the way it does. Hi Ted, how are you?
Hi Miss Ella. Hi everyone. I'm doing great, thank you. And I'm so happy to share with you some ideas about the Baroque period in music because it's a big favorite of mine, especially the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. It's so much fun to play. Bach's music is endlessly fascinating to me. You know, I think I first heard his concerto for two violins back when I was about your age, and I was just entranced by its dark, swirling energy. I think that's the piece that began my lifelong enjoyment of the music of Bach and other composers of the Baroque times. And the more I've learned about them, the more I've loved their music. I hope you'll come to feel the same way. Music of the past tells us what life was like in the time when it was composed. So what does Baroque music have to tell us? Well, one thing we might notice about Baroque music is its rather serious sound, a noble sound. For instance, Do you hear what I mean? It's very beautiful, very direct, and rather formal. Why do you think it sounds like that? Well, last week, Miss Ella taught us that Bach and other Baroque composers wrote music for two main audiences. Do you remember? That's right. The court, meaning the king and queen and other fancy people who listen to music with them, and for the church, for religious services. Baroque music sounds so serious and noble because it's showing respect for the king and for God. Two pretty important audiences. What else do we notice about Baroque music? Well, last week our friend Jeffrey taught us about the harpsichord, a cousin of the piano. Do you remember it had two keyboards? He also told us about two things we hear in Baroque music: ornament and imitation. Ornament sounded like this. And imitation sounds like this. You hear a melody in my left hand, and then you hear it in the right hand. And on with the same melody. What does that tell us about life in the Baroque times? Well, what if you could see ornament and imitation? What would that look like? Maybe it would look like this. Palaces and churches built in Baroque times, many still standing today, are very grand, noble buildings. Do you see the big curving shapes? Do you see the imitation, the columns, the windows, the elements that repeat over and over? And what about those decorations? This ceiling is just alive with ornament. Even the furniture would be covered in rich fabrics with vivid colors and big curving shapes. And remember that colorful harpsichord we saw last week? Even musical instruments were decorated. Imitation, decoration, grandeur, even in the clothes that rich and powerful people would wear. Very fancy, expensive fabrics, big curving shapes, lots of ruffles and bows, like the buildings and like the music. Now we have to remember that not everyone was rich and powerful in the Baroque period. Musicians and composers were not rich and powerful at all. They were more like servants. Bach wrote a letter to the Duke of Brandenburg, the one for whom he wrote the Brandenburg Concertos, do you remember? And in that letter, Bach showed great respect using words like, my lord, and your royal highness. And he wrote very humbly about himself, even as a musician, because musicians and composers worked for the nobles and for the church. They were more like servants, not at all like equals. But the language Bach used in that letter was like his music, serious and noble and very decorated with fancy words. This is something interesting to think about, though. The Duke of Brandenburg was wealthy and powerful in his own time, but who thinks about him today? Bach is the one we remember today. His music is played and enjoyed all over the world, every day. This is an important lesson. Artistry and talent are much more important in the long run than wealth and status. I hope you've enjoyed learning something about Baroque culture and about how the sound of the music tells us something about what life was like back then. That's one of the most exciting and fun things about classical music. When you listen to it, it's like traveling to different times and places across hundreds of years to experience the sounds and feelings people enjoyed then. I'm looking forward to seeing you again to learn about some different periods of music. Until then, I hope you enjoy listening to and playing some Baroque music.
Thank you so much, Ted. I hope we will see you again soon. This is all for today's lesson, but you can continue to listen to Bach's concerto on YouTube and try to count how many times you hear the phrase we learned today. You can also listen to the second and third movements of the piece. They are just as beautiful as the first movement, but very different. I hope you enjoyed our time together, and I will see you next week when we will meet with the violin player you saw earlier today in this lesson. Be sure to join us to learn more about this fascinating instrument. See you next time, and until then, make it a musical week.